Sure. I'm Scott Bannon, and this story is related to when I was on active duty in the Coast Guard in 1994 when we worked an operation to rescue Cuban immigrants trying to flee from Cuba and enter the United States.
Can you please explain that?
Sure. In 1994, there was a policy change on behalf of the Cuban government that allowed people to try and leave Cuba and make an effort to get into the United States. This affected thousands of people that were trying to get to a better way of life and leave a communist country. So the Coast Guard was called to interdict the migrants as they tried to cross the Straits of Florida. And it was really more about saving people than it was trying to prevent people coming into the United States. But there is a policy that prevents them from coming into the United States in that manner. It would be illegal. But during the course of that, we rescued overall about 31,000 people. And I was only involved in rescuing about 1,000 people or so within about a month's period while we were down there.
After that 31,000 people you saved, do you think you got most of the people there, or do you think you could have saved more?
I think the largest number of people that left were interdicted or rescued. That 31,000 is kind of a round number, but unfortunately I think there were people that did not survive the trip. That people packed their families onto rafts and small boats and tried to make the attempt to get to Florida and get to the United States that did not survive. And we have no way to know how many of those did not make it. Others encountered some difficulties along the way and made it back into Cuba. And then there were some that were probably picked up by passing ships and that went to other countries and then either made their way back home or into the United States.
Thank you. All right, can you please keep explaining?
Which part?
And the first part that comes to mind.
Oh, about the trip?
Yes, sir.
All right, well, it started out as I was stationed here in Mobile, and we got the call that we needed to escort a smaller boat from Pascagoula, Mississippi, down to Key West to help with this operation. And naturally, once we got there, there was an overwhelming number of people that were trying to leave Cuba, so they had us stay. And so we immediately began to pick up people while they were out in the Straits of Florida. And it was kind of overwhelming because at night it looked like there were stars on the water because they would light candles or flick flashlights. And when we looked out over the water, it looked like the stars were on the water. There were so many people in their rafts, and we had to be very careful that we didn't run them over or capsize any of them. So we would just get among them and start picking them up. And we could carry about 100 to 150 people at one time. And then we would have to leave. So we would leave people and go to a larger cutter or a Navy ship and offload, and then we'd go do it again.
Okay, thank you. Maybe you could tell us about the feet wet dry policy.
Sure. If you're from Cuba and you can get what we call feet dry, that means you make it to the mainland of the United States, you're eligible to apply for asylum and stay in the United States. This was at that time. The policy may have changed since then. But if you were feet wet, that means you were interdicted at sea and you did not make it to land, then you were going to be repatriated. That means you were put either on a Coast Guard cutter and sent back to Havana, Cuba, or you were sent to a larger Coast Guard cutter or a Navy ship, and eventually you were placed in a camp on Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, on the south side that is a U.S. naval base.
Thank you. Now, maybe could you tell us the Cubans threatening your crew?
Sure. During operations where we were picking up people out of rafts, there were two Cuban gunboats, is how we refer to them. They're small boats that have some small weapons on them. And they began to approach us because Cuba recognizes a different territorial sea. That means the amount of water that they claim off of their shoreline is a little bit different than what the rest of the world recognizes. So there's international agreements on how far a country can claim. So when you would get close to that line, those Cuban boats would come out and watch us. Well, in this particular incident, there were two boats that came directly at us, and so we turned and moved away. And as we moved away, they continued to come after us. And they got so close that they came right beside us and circled us. They were faster than we were. And so it was kind of tense at first to see, were they going to try and stop us? Were they going to try and shoot at us? And ultimately, they had TV cameras on the back, and so we think they were just filming the events that were occurring, and then they probably used that in some form of propaganda back in Cuba.
Thank you. And one more thing, do you think you can tell us about the hand grenade you found?
Yes, my job was on the bridge of the ship, so I operated radios and did the navigation and recorded all the information about where we were, how many people we were interdicting. And one of the crewmen called up to me and asked, what I thought this object was, and they held it up, and I walked out there, and I said, I know what that object is. I said, that is a hand grenade. I said, please throw it overboard. Some people would bring items that were weapons, and they thought maybe they could bully their way or threaten us to come into the United States. Well, these people, they didn't threaten us. They never even made us aware that they had the hand grenade. It was in some of their baggage, and we just go through all of it, and we just threw it overboard. So they never tried to fight us. Most of them were very appreciative of being picked up.
Out of that, what you just explained, do you think there was any intentions what they were going to do with that?
I think it was
like
just an act of desperation. These people live in a country where they're very repressed, and they potentially weren't going to even use it against us. Maybe they were going to use it against a Cuban boat that would try and pick them up, and they did not want to go back to Cuba. It's hard to say, but desperate people will do desperate things, and it was unfortunate that they're fleeing a country that they barely have basic necessities, and so they were trying to get a better way of life, and that's why they would risk their families to try and cross the Straits of Florida.
Well, thank you very much for being with me here today. Could you please introduce yourself again?
Again, I'm Scott Bannon, and this was a story related to the interdiction of Cuban migrants fleeing Cuba in 1994.
Thank you.